So for our final project, we're going to be doing a magazine spread. I'm not going to read this word for word because it's a lot of text. What we're going to be doing is for the contemporary art publication Juxtapose magazine. For those of you guys that don't know, it's an actual magazine. We're gonna, again, with both of these things, we're gonna do a little bit of research, look into the subject, but also look into the magazine so you can see some of the attitudes that the magazine has. It's a contemporary art magazine. I'll show you some samples. A lot of times they focus on like alternative art. They started sort of more West Coast alternative art, focusing on like installation art and even street art. So they have sort of a more like a more alternative arts look anyway. Now that they've been, I don't even know how long they've been around. They've been around for a long time. Now they do a lot more sort of like traditional contemporary stuff, but you'll see a lot of their stuff is sort of the more alternative art stuff, and a lot of it can be very, very weird. Anyway, so we're going to have your editor has requested, it's going to be 6 facing pages, and we're going to be looking at the work of Richard Prince. And this is where I was telling you I was going to try not to fanboy out too much because Richard Prince is my favorite artist ever. But he's also a very, very important contemporary artist. He's still alive today. I wouldn't say the most, but arguably he's one of the most important American artists working today, specifically because of what he deals with, specifically with appropriation, which is basically a fancy art word for stealing, which we'll get into in a little bit. So just to get over some of the assignment specifics. So our assignment goals are to select and display a selection of images in a clean and attractive way, basically concentrate on layout. Again, think about all the things that we've been covering this semester, and then also some of the things, even though it was only like one page technically, but the postcard, like when we think about balanced design, things like that. To make copy and images work together in a thoughtful composition, we're going to have copy as well because it's an article. Use a column structure of a page when arranging many different elements. I know it was like the first and second assignment when we talked about columns, grids, et cetera, et cetera. But again, this is where we're sort of putting everything together. This is also why I wanted to give you guys an ample amount of time to play around with these. If you wanted to play around with a couple of different layouts or grids, feel free to thumbnail either digitally or physically pen and paper. Anyway, to further develop an understanding and practical use of typography and images. And I have to change that because I meant to put 18. What we're going to have is the name of our publication, Juxtapose Magazine, publishing date May 22nd, 2018. Publication will print in CMYK, so just to make sure that our document is CMYK. Page sizes, you're going to set these up, 8.5 by 10.5 with 1/8 inch margins. Page numbers, we're going to be starting with the left page, so they're going to be automatically opening. We're going to have 3 spreads, so we're going to have 6 facing pages, right? So we're going to start on the left side because this is going to kind of start in the middle of the magazine. So we're going to have starting with page 32, and then a column structure. So 3 columns per page with 1/8 inch gutters. You may work with more columns, but they must be in multiples of 3. So think about, remember when we talked about those grids, how like you could tell some of them had like definitely the 3 columns, but then when you set up your guides, like oftentimes there was that one that had the crazy grid. It was a 3-column, what was it? It was a 3-column spread, but then they had like a grid that almost went down to like, I think it had like at least 9 or like maybe even more than that. 15 or whatever it was, but they had like the crazy grid in there just because they had some funky shapes and things going on. So think about going back to that, but just work with multiples of 3 because it's a 3-column structure. And then a little bit about Juxtapose. I'm not going to read all of this, but you can see I kind of grabbed this from their site. But originally, with the mission of connecting modern art genres like psychedelic, hot rod art, graffiti, street art, and illustration to the context of more historically recognized genres. So basically, they were their aim was to take some of these more alternative art forms and really sort of lend them a little bit more credibility, and connect them to more traditionally recognized genres like pop, assemblage, old master painting, et cetera, et cetera. again, so based in San Francisco, founded upon the belief in the virtues of Southern California pop culture and the freedom from the conventions of the established New York City art world. Essentially, the art world runs through New York, whether people like it or not. I mean, the art world is New York. But they wanted to take that sort of, they wanted to sort of flip that sort of traditional established New York City snobby, essentially, gallery world and sort of flip it on its head, but also say that this stuff belongs in this context as well. That's where you definitely still have an East Coast, West Coast thing going on with art for sure. Specifics, we're going to have at least 6 photographs in the spread. You may use more. The images provided are the only images you're allowed to use for the spread, or for the article rather. Photos cannot be cropped, and should have an asterisk there, but all photos to be used without distortion, special attention paid to avoiding horizontal or vertical unproportional stretch. So make sure that you are constraining your proportions when you scale or resize photos. Don't stretch the work, kind of like the logos. Don't stretch the work. All body copy must be at least 12 point. So you'll see once you start laying these out, you can go a little bit bigger. But generally in magazine, you don't want to go, less than 12 point, because then it is hard to read. But you must use all the copy in its entirety. The layout of the copy is totally up to you, so however you structure that. When we talked about going from text frame to text frame and text flow, and even importing your text into your text frame. So however your text flows is completely up to you, but you must use all of the text. You have to have a headline. So in your spread, a headline, and it's totally up to you what the headline is, kind of like our BMW ads. Photo captions. So we're going to have basically just this dummy. I'm not going to expect you guys to look. I mean, if you really want to, you can. But I'm not going to expect you guys to look up the title and the info on each piece. But you can have, basically this copied and pasted underneath, without the quotes, obviously. Copied and pasted underneath, or somewhere as a photo caption. This is a dummy caption, blah, blah, blah. If you have, there was in the past, people have done, if you have like a grouping of photos, you can have just one. You don't have to have one for each of them. Yeah. Or if you wanted to do, in the past, somebody did like whatever it was, like starting from top left clockwise, and then they had this, because they'll do that a lot in magazines where they have like multiple images. They'll say like, from left to right or whatever. So if you wanted to do that as a little extra thing, that's totally fine. They must have page numbers and magazine title on each page. And then we'll get into this. I'll probably save this for next class, so I'm not talking so much. But all pages must include a next and a previous navigation button. This is when we're going to start to talk a little bit about interactivity and doing simple interactivity with InDesign and exporting for PDFs. So we're going to have, so you can have a next and a back button for digital viewing. The spread must include at least 3 bookmarks, which are anchors within the document that you can set. Generally, for a smaller document like this, they're kind of sort of silly, but I just want to make sure that you know how to do them. Where it would be, if this was like a 20-page spread or even a catalog or something like that, like the bookmarks make a little bit more sense to drive you to specific categories or to specific spots within a document. But I just wanted to make sure to show you guys how to do some of these simple interactivity things. And then all magazine titles must include a hyperlink to juxtapose.com. So you have your title wherever you put it, and you make it a hyperlink, which is simple to do. But again, some simple interactivity to add to this assignment. And I'll show you that next class, how to do these things. They're all relatively simple. And then when you also export, the nice thing about InDesign is when you export for an interactive PDF, it has all of these elements. But then if you were to export for print, it would not show any of the interactivity. So you wouldn't have to worry about having, like, if this were go to actual physical publication, you wouldn't have to worry about printing the next and previous buttons. They would just automatically not be shown. So any interactive elements would automatically be hidden when they go to press, basically. So you're not having to do 2 different files, one for press and one for interactivity, right? And then here, it's just some specifics about grading, but we're going to have submissions. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to package our layout into a folder. We're going to have one extra thing because when you do package, because packaging is for press, we're going to also save your layout, export your layout as an interactive PDF, which is just one extra step. You're just going to export just the document again, and then you're just going to choose, I'll walk you through it, but you're just going to choose interactive PDF. So you're technically going to like export twice. You're going to package and then export your interactive PDF because you cannot package an interactive PDF because packaging is specifically for print, so it won't do the interactivity. I thought it might. I double-checked, but it does not. And then just some grading criteria, use of photos, use of typography, use of columns, and then overall design, things like that. Are there any I know that was just a ton to go through really fast. Are there any general questions about Final Project before we move on? All right, let's talk a little bit about, let me hide this. We'll talk a little bit about content and what we're going to do first. I'm going to do this. Should have brought this up in the first place, but just to show you a little bit about Juxtaposed Magazine. Again, do some research. This is why I give you guys some extra time. Oh, and I looked at Origins last class, so that's why I'm getting all these ads now. It's funny. Oh, those algorithms. So you can see with their first page here, now you can see they get a little bit, I wouldn't say traditional, but we have anywhere from street art in the gallery sense here. They even have some time-based media. You can see some installations or murals, even some what looks like more somewhat traditional contemporary abstract art. And then they have a couple different ads and things like that. A cool article about Abramovich. She's very, very interesting, very strange. She often hurts herself a lot for her performance art, which is really interesting. But you can see again, so going down here with some of the previews, as you can see a little bit more traditional, a little bit more avant-garde, I guess, or a little bit more non-traditional art mixed together, so you can kind of see their look. But look through their website, check out some of the articles there. It's also a really cool magazine publication / website in general. It's a really interesting publication in general to check out and keep an eye on. I try to keep an eye on it as much as I can because they do a lot of really cool, again, a good mix of sort of traditional contemporary art and alternative art, which is really, really cool. Again, anyway, so you can see, take a look through. I wanted to show you Juxtapose, their website, before moving on here. So talking about Richard Prince. Richard Prince, again, he's still alive today. Started working late 60s, early 70s. I think one of the reasons why I sort of gravitate towards him as well is because he and I sort of had similar backgrounds. He started in advertising, graphic design and advertising, relatively young, and sort of worked his way up from the bottom-ish before he started making art. He would work for a variety of different ad houses. He was sort of like low man on the totem pole there, where he was doing tear sheets, which was back in the day when you actually had an ad run. You actually had to physically tear the ad out of the magazine. So you had to buy the publication, tear the sheet, and then archive that. So that's how they had their archive of stuff. Now it's all digital, so it doesn't really matter. But while he was doing all these tear sheets, he started getting into because they would organize them in a certain way. So he started getting into these weird organizational things. He was starting to play around with appropriation. Again, a fancy word for stealing. It's not, especially in his time, wasn't anything new. Appropriation in art has been around for a long, long time. Some of the, I wouldn't say the earliest, but one of the more recognizable sort of early ones is Duchamp and the urinal piece. It's more of a ready-made, but still sort of appropriation, where he was taking an already existing object and literally flipping it for the sake of art. There's this sort of, the quick backstory is he did that and Duchamp was really famous at this point already. And there was a call for an open contemporary art show, and he decided to see how far he could push that. So that's why he submitted this urinal, flipped it upside down and called it Fountain, and then signed it R. Mutt so that people didn't know it was Duchamp. And of course it got rejected. And then he was like, but you said it was. So it's really more of like just to kind of flip off the gallery that was putting on this opening. So he's really kind of pushing the boundaries of art. And that's what happens with a lot of ready-mades, a lot of appropriation, and a lot of contemporary conceptual art is like you kind of have to know the backstory, which essentially can be boring sometimes. Like if you just see, I don't know, a blue dot on a canvas, you're like, oh great, it's a blue dot on the canvas. But then sometimes the background of the story, the reason the piece was done can be a little bit more interesting. So anyway, so this was all happening around the time where he was sort of first starting. You had guys like Warhol that we're all familiar with. Warhol was probably the most famous appropriation artist. Most, if not all, of his pieces were commercial pieces that he turned into art, where he had his silk screens. The famous now, the Marilyn Monroe pieces of variety of different colors, and the soup cans, the soup labels, the soup cans, and things like that. The silk screens of those. So appropriation was nothing new. He just took it into a very different direction, where he started photographing these tear sheets and started photographing these images. Let's go to his website. Is really hit or miss, so that's why I have all these other tabs open. But just to show you a couple, so his early works. This one is one of his more famous ones. His cowboy images. So what he was doing was, let's see if there's others here. So here's another. Maybe. There we go. Oh, that didn't help at all. Anyway, you get the general idea. I'm trying to see if there's another. There's our Kool-Aid piece. Let's go back to this one anyway. So the cowboy pieces were actually Marlboro ads that were rephotographed. Mm-hmm. So what he was doing was looking at these tear sheets and looking at this commercial photography. And the Marlboro ads, or the Cowboy series, had a lot more going on to it than just that. Like, he thought it was really weird that the way that they were advertising cigarettes and blah, blah, blah. But what he was doing he was literally rephotographing the ads, cropping out anything that was branded. So and then he would represent these, and he would print these rather large too. This is 50 by 75 inches, so he would print these like huge, and they would get a lot of grain, so the grain would kind of affect the print and things like that. But he would represent these as his photo, because technically they are his photographs, right? Like, he took the picture. So what he was really doing, in the same way Duchamp was doing, was he was really sort of pushing the bounds of, sort of pushing the rules, I guess, of art, right? And then he started doing things like this, his gangs. This isn't a really good photograph of it, but and a lot of his things come from printing as well. Let's try to see if we can go back to. That's a really weird self-portrait. He's an odd dude. That's another reason why I think I like him. But yeah, he's a weird guy. I'm trying to see if there's some of his gangs in this. Sorry for my disorganization here. Anyway, so he would do these. I was trying to find a better picture. He would do these runs where he would call them gangs, right? And a lot of times, like this one is a little bit more literal, where he would take some of his rephotographs. He would use. Now I'm trying to find. There we go. Part of his Girlfriend series. A lot of his pieces also were always like untitled, and then they would have like a subtitle. So this was like a piece from his Girlfriend series, but this specific piece is untitled, from Cowboys and Girlfriends. So in these cases, he was looking at like some of the magazines that were being published at the time. Like he was very into like the muscle car and motorcycle magazines, Easy Rider and whatever, and how like the motorcycles and the women were both sort of like presented as like property, essentially. Like, these guys were submitting pictures and like, check out what I own, my chick and my bike kind of things, like a very sort of womanizing-ish. So he was looking into that and rephotographing these pieces, but then he would also have a whole bunch of different collections that were like similar. And in the printing world, what they would do is, if they had let's say, 12 business cards to print from different clients. They would set them up, since they would all be the same size, they would set them up in one run, and they would call it a gang run because you're gang printing. So he was kind of mixing those two terms together. So the production background that he had with his production knowledge, and then also like the sort of literal nod to gangs. But he had other pieces as well. So this would be a series of Gang of Girlfriends. Live Free or Die, he called this one. So he has all the different like Easy Rider, motorcycle magazine, things like that. And then he also had, I'm trying to see if there's another. It's the Girlfriend series. He would also have, in the more commercial world, there would be like modeling images. Let's go through, I don't want to go through like all of this. So some of the photographs, like he would look through as he was doing these tear sheets, if it was for like, I don't know, like watches. Why is none of this loading? There we go. For like watches or something like that, like you would have all of these. So now you can see some of the Girlfriend series, and then Cowboys and Girlfriends gang. But a lot of times, like you would have, men in suits, with watches and things like that. So he would take, 12 men. Like here's another gang here, Cloud Gang, to where it was all images of the sky from some of his Marlboro series or some of his Cowboy series, and then he has some jokes, which we'll get to later, some joke paintings. So there's an example of one of his gangs. Like these pictures here. So he has like the couples. Like he would have a lot of these weird commercial photography things where like these could be, who knows, there could be an ad for suits or cologne or whatever. But a lot of times he would have these, and he would gang these as like couples, like his couples gang. Or he would have a gang of, men in suits looking to the left or something like that. So he was like organizing these things in just kind of odd ways. I think to just sort of like play around with the idea of doing, doing some of these things. Here's some more Cowboys. So his early work was really more rephotographing existing ads and taking out anything commercial and representing them as his artwork. And that's where sort of the controversies first started with Richard Prince, where like Marlboro tried to sue him because he was using their imagery, and Marlboro tried to sue him and they lost. So he thought like, well, this is kind of an interesting thing here. So it was, the precedent was set that it falls under fair use, and essentially fair use is you're essentially allowed to use just about anything for the purposes of creation. But if it also, I forget what the term is, it's in one of these articles, but if you add something of value, whether physically or socially, to the original object, it falls under fair use. So since he's basically creating art with it, he's adding cultural value to this object that already existed. So therefore, he's creating something new, or he's adding something new to it. So that was a precedent case where he won his case versus Marlboro, and so he started really pushing that boundary, and he started doing a lot more things with commercial things, and he still does it today. So I think he also kind of likes controversy as well, because it also, it's kind of the whole no such thing as bad publicity thing. He also likes the controversy because it sort of keeps his name out there, but he also does some really cool conceptual things. So as you see throughout his career, he's so super minimal on his website, it drives me crazy. He has a different series of paintings that he does and that he's been doing for many, many years. A lot of them sort of were kind of like nods to color field painters, where he would have, this is going to take a little while to load. They would essentially be like sort of a nod to abstract expressionism or color field paintings, where he would have large, and again, he works really big most of the time. He would have, he would have large joke paintings where there were like, some of these were a little bit more sort of expressionist, and then he would have where the appropriation part of it was, he would take like these old hack jokes, one-liners from like usually the New Yorker or things like that, and he would, or those old like Henny Youngman, or those one-liner comics, like comedians, and he would typeset himself, because back in the day he was making stencils. Come on. And again, you can see Working rather large, 90 inches almost by 75. It's pretty big painting. I don't know why this is taking so long to load. Let's go to, so here's another example of a joke painting. And you can kind of, I mean, the joke probably isn't the important part, but you get the idea. And then he would kind of break these, he would break them down too. And I honestly don't know why he chose to typeset them the way he did. This is another one that's a little bit more, it's obviously a little bit more readable when you are there, but you know, you can see that this one's a little bit more sort of the background is more of a nod to that abstract expressionism. I also think he used checks. He got into like commerciality of like you know how you can order checks with like whatever image. You can probably do custom images now, whatever. He thought that like at the time he thought that was like really interesting. You could order, you know, checks with pictures of Mickey Mouse on them. He thought that was really weird that like, okay, like they're essentially money, and why are we putting cartoon characters on our money? So he would order custom checks. Like he would make not fake bank accounts, but he would make like dummy bank accounts so he could order checkbooks, and then he would use those as his medium. So he would line this giant canvas with like however many checks and then paint over them and add them. So he was almost making like collage work with the checks and painting and whatever, and then doing the jokes on top of them. And then I was going to say, I honestly don't know why he would break up the text the way he does. I think just he found it visually interesting for some reason. Yeah, this one you can't really see, but you get, you know, again, you have that background. It's a little bit more, sometimes they were more solid color. Sometimes they were a little bit more sort of, again, that nod to the color field contemporaries that were working in his time. There's some more cowboys there, girlfriends, cowboys. Let's see what else. Joke paintings, cowboys. And then he started getting into some more sculptural objects like this and his basketball hoops and car hoods. You know, he thought it was very interesting, you know, again, growing up in the time with the muscle cars and motorcycles. He thought it was interesting that today you could, well, not today, but relatively today, that you could order just about anything. So you could order pretty much in parts, either online or through magazines, that you could order parts of a car and make a muscle car at home. So he was ordering, like, you know, and a lot of these things, you know, they felt like sculptural objects anyway. So he was ordering, like, a lot of times just like a hood and then painting it in a similar way to his joke paintings and things like that. So some of them were a little bit more rough. Some of them were a little bit more finished. Probably under sculptures. Yeah, so here's a car hood. One of his car hoods, it's a little bit fiberglass, wood, acrylic, and Bondo. So he would mount these to wood and then often fill them with Bondo is like a body filler, like an automotive body filler. So some of them he would leave pretty raw like this, and then some of them he would paint almost like his joke paintings. Trying to see what's in. Oh yeah, his untitled, yeah, his originals. He was doing. Let's see, his nurse paintings. So another example of his appropriation. There was this weird genre of romance novel. There was like these nurse fantasy romance novel things, but a lot of times they would like, I don't know, like Safari Nurse, Settlement Nurse, and like these are actual book titles. Dude Ranch Nurse. Like a lot of times they were set in like these really weird environments. Like there was one, I forget, there was one that was like set in like a war zone. He was just like, what, really, a romance novel, nurse in a war zone? Like that's gross. So that, anyway, so that's where he got these. He would put masks on them because he thought like the romance novel and the whole medical thing was a little bit creepy to begin with. And then he would rephotograph or digitally scan and print these book covers, and then he would modify them. He would paint over them, put these masks on them, and you can see again doing this. He would cover up basically any of the other info, but essentially sort of do it in his similar painting manner that he has been doing. But he would leave the titles. Some of them were a little bit more obscure than others. But again, another use of his appropriation. One of them, it's not on his website, but one of them was used for, to date myself, was used for a Sonic Youth album cover, which is pretty cool. I don't know if it's on here. But again, you can see nurses' dormitory, all these weird. I'm trying to see if the Sonic Youth one is on here. Not that it really matters, but anyway. So the Sonic Youth one was kind of interesting because then that went back to being a commercial object, right? An album cover. So it was like, took this commercial object, turned it into a piece of art, and then it turned back into a piece of commercial work, which I thought was kind of interesting. And then it happens that Sonic Youth actually isn't a bad band. So, but anyway, so we can see sort of where he's going, and he's working on these. He still works on most of these. Like I think he still does some nurse paintings, not as much. He still works on a lot of his drawings, which are sort of nods to the old like New Yorker comics and things like that. So a lot of these, like, again, I think he's still working on like his joke paintings, for example. Why isn't that loading? I'm trying to see. Yeah, 2003. If it loads. So they're still relatively recent. So even though he's been doing a lot of these pieces since like the 70s, 80s, you know, he still goes back to and works on a lot of these. Anyway, let's go into some of the controversy, and then I'll stop blabbering about him. So even today, relatively recently, his one of his more recent controversies was with Instagram, and I have a couple of different articles here if you guys hadn't seen it or not. One of his sort of more was 2015, so in the art world, very recent. He had an exhibition. I think there's other images here where he was taking Instagram photos and representing them as his work in a somewhat similar manner. But essentially, he was challenging, and then here's an article more just about him in general. I'm trying to find, there we go. His Instagram works, where he was obviously not randomly selecting them because he's selecting them, but some of them were famous people, some of them were civilians, for lack of a better word, where he ended up relatively, and you can see again he printed these rather large, but part of what he was challenging was like when we're putting stuff out there on the internet, like it's out there and there's no getting it back. But when you put something specifically, especially when not even just artists, but when you put something out there on the internet, like it's there for pretty much anybody to do what they want with, and you, not that you don't have any say, but you have a very limited say over what people do with whatever you put out there. So you basically kind of have to be careful what you put out there. So Instagram at the time was this very new thing. People were putting all sorts of images. Like we're basically like all we're doing is pumping out content, right? So he thought that was really interesting. So he took this content and didn't touch it like he usually does and just represented it in the art context. And where he kind of got in trouble was, let's see, there's one of his cowboys, his collections, more pieces. I was going to see if there was more of the Instagram thing. There he is as a young, brooding artist. There's some more Instagram stuff. So you can see there's some famous people in here, and then there's some not famous people. But what ended up happening was, I'm going to probably butcher the story, but at the gallery, obviously these are Richard Prince works, and they're printed, like it's not just like he grabbed them and just hit print on some old inkjet. Like they're archival. I mean, they're expensive prints. Like they're archival quality, you know, prints. So you're buying like a high quality print anyway. You know what I mean? But also since it's Richard Prince, he was selling these for, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So he had a gallery exhibition where, you know, these were priced at whatever they were, but where he ended up getting in trouble was there's an alternative modeling agency, I guess, if you guys aren't familiar. I'm relatively familiar because of the controversy, but they're called Suicide Girls, and they're like this alternative models, usually heavily tattooed, crazy hair, things like that. So this alternative modeling agency, and they were doing essentially a fundraiser where they had, I think it was a calendar or something. They were selling prints of their images and whatever, and one of their images was on Instagram and ended up in his show. And I don't think he says he didn't. I don't think he did on purpose grab this one for the sole purpose of creating this controversy. But they were selling these pieces for whatever it was, like $100, like $100 a print, and it went to charity, whatever. But of course, since it's Richard Prince, his sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And they were like, well, what the hell? Like, it's the same exact image, and yours is selling for $100,000, and ours is like, you stole our image, and essentially you're stealing that money from us and from our charity. Blah, blah, blah. So I think it's still going on. I don't think that case is over. Clearly, he's not stopping. But again, this sort of goes back to, here we go. This sort of goes back to, I think he kind of likes the controversy. But you have, so not only were Prince's unwilling subjects unhappy that their images had been stolen, they were angry that he had sold the prints for a whopping $90,000. So the student, this student, I'm extremely broke, and here's this middle-aged white man making a huge profit off of my image. Kind of makes me sick. That's kind of like, well, yeah, that's kind of what he was challenging. Like, you put the content out there, like, I can do what I want with it, essentially. So you gotta be careful about what you put out there. So anyway, this gets into the whole Suicide Girls thing. Rephotographed her piece for $90. That's what it was, and then whatever. So he's no stranger to controversy, which is another reason why he's in the art world. He's definitely an important artist because of the appropriation. But he's also still really challenging, for better or for worse, like him or not. Like, he's still really, really challenging the boundaries of art and what art can and can't be. Another one that he's in trouble with for this is these pieces, where he was taking image of Rastafarians from books and doing his collage work, doing his thing, like here. So this is the original photograph, and then he would do his Richard Prince thing to it. I think he's being sued now for this one as well, and we'll see whether he wins or not. Another thing that he would get in trouble for was one of the things that he would push would be, I'm looking for, here's one of the joke paintings. Would be he would do collaborations, or he would call them collaborations, where he would rephotograph other artists' work. So like Cindy Sherman, I believe, was one of them, where she was essentially, and if you're not familiar with her work, some of her pieces was she would recreate film stills using herself as the subject. So like, she probably didn't do this, but like using a film still from like Breakfast at Tiffany's, where she's the main character and she's photographing that. So she's kind of creating these film stills. He would rephotograph her photograph and call it a collaboration with Cindy Sherman and blah, blah, blah. And of course she got pissed. But his whole thing was like, okay, you're already taking someone's art and recreating it. I'm just doing the same thing you're doing. So it was like that sort of, he was sort of challenging what she was doing in a somewhat aggressive kind of way. I'm trying to see if there's any of the collaborations in here. But anyway, so you kind of get the idea. There's another self-portrait. I'm trying to see if there's... Anyway, so he would do that a lot. And then he also had... I always want to say Cy Twombly, but it's not Cy Twombly. William de Kooning. He would do these collaborations where he would take de Kooning paintings. De Kooning did these really grotesque abstracted figures, and then he would do his... Richard Prince would take his paintings and rephotograph them and then do like crazy collage work, often a lot of times perverse, I think, just to stir up controversy. But he would call them his collaborations with de Kooning. And then lastly, not to get too controversial or whatever, this was probably his most important piece, but then also talking about ownership. This is where he sort of first started talking about ownership, what constitutes art, and also like major lawsuit stuff. So this was called Spiritual America. It's a super important piece in his timeline. This was a commercial photograph, and I forget what it was for. I think like for perfume or something. I forget what it was for. But it was a commercial photograph of an obviously underage girl nude. She's nude. I mean, you don't see like everything, but you know what I mean? Enough for probably an underage girl not to be a commercial photograph like this. More importantly is it's Brooke Shields. And her mother okayed this photograph at the time for the commercial use. So it was going, and then Brooke Shields became hugely famous, obviously. And so she didn't even have control of this image because her parents signed away her rights to, whatever. And so he thought that was really weird. And obviously, for obvious reasons, he thought the whole thing was really weird. But then he was like, all right, well, I'll push this and rephotograph it. And he called it Spiritual America because it was more about how we're more interested in the dollar and blah, blah, blah. And we're like literally willing to sell our own kids to make some money. But then where the real controversy came from was after she was hugely famous. This piece was produced in 1983. And I'm assuming she's been famous forever. But I'm assuming, I think that was probably arguably in like the height of her fame. Like obviously she wanted this buried, and she tried to sue him, and like she doesn't even come close to owning the photo. Like the original artist owns the photo, and there's nothing even like her mother or her at the time could do. And I think her mother and her had an odd relationship anyway too. So I think it didn't help with that relationship, but it also, it didn't help that she was famous, so she didn't want this image going around or whatever. So that was another thing that so this was sort of one of his more like serious challenges, was that he was, really attacking commercial photography and where ownership can take us, and, essentially what we'll do for greed, I guess. We're sort of literally willing to sell our own children for some money or a little bit of fame. I think that was part of the troubled relationship, I believe, with Brooke Shields and her mother. But anyway, he's done a lot related to, like, he'll call things Spiritual America, or he'll reference that a lot. Not that photo, but he'll reference the title a lot. Going back to that, sort of again from his early roots to where he was using sort of commercial money-driven photography, for better or for worse, for his own gain. If other people are using it, he might as well make something out of it too. So this is the subject of our final project. And again, this is just to give you guys some research. I'll post a couple of these links so you guys can dig into this. But what we're going to be doing, again, and I'll get into more specifics later, with setting up your InDesign file. We all kind of know. I'll go back to this. We all kind of know about setting up our InDesign file to begin with, but I'll get into some more specifics with creating some of the interactivity, which again are fairly easy. So next class we'll get into creating some of the interactivity. But again, do some research. I obviously urge you to check out Richard Prince, honestly, because I think he's a phenomenal artist, but also because I find the way he aggressively challenges art and our culture really, really interesting. Some of it's kind of gross, but all of it, I think is really interesting. Check out Juxtapose magazine just to get a feel for the client that we're going to be doing these layouts for. Again, I believe they still have it if you guys are around at any point. I believe they should still have it at, I still want to call it Borders, but whatever the bookstore is, Books A Million. I believe they carry Juxtapose. It's a relatively expensive magazine, so I don't suggest you go buying it. Most art magazines are kind of expensive just because of how they're printed. They're usually high quality paper. They're weird. They're generally weird sizes, so they're not able to be done in gang runs. Going back to that term, but they're usually high quality prints, high quality paper. You don't want to print all this like gorgeous artwork on like crap paper, right? But you can definitely take a look at it. I believe they still carry it. A lot of places that carry a decent selection of magazines will have Juxtapose. It's fairly easy to find. But definitely look at their website. If you can find an actual publication to check out, you don't have to copy their layout by any means, but just to get an idea or a sense of how they set things up. And also look at other art magazines, look at other like actual publications if you get the chance or make the chance to look at other art publications to see how different they are. I know we talked about it way earlier with the grids assignment, but how different they are from more sort of traditional magazines like, going back to like Time magazine versus Juxtapose, like they're going to be very different. Like a visually driven magazine, and especially an arts magazine, you're sort of expected it to be a little bit different, a little bit out there, rather than just picture column. So you'll see kind of how how these things are set up, and how visual arts magazines really vary from more traditional publications. But definitely do some research. Again, that's why I wanted to give you ample time to do this assignment. Do the research on both subject and client, and take a look at the materials. That's what I was going to show you. The materials are all in our final projects folder. This is in the assignments folder. We now have a final projects folder, and you'll see we have the description, so you guys can check it out, and then also the materials. So we have the copy, which, going back to, we're going to place that copy into our, if it ever opens, I'm not going to worry about it. It's just a Word doc, and you'll see how it's organized. It's just kind of a quick bio. You have your intro, and then his childhood and education, blah, blah, blah. So not a ton of copy, so you have a decent amount of space to play with. And then our images are here. So going through, there's the gang of men looking to the right or left, depending on cowboys, etc., etc. Joe paintings. So you can look through these and see how you want them to be set up. Going back to cropping. I'm glad I stopped on this one. Going back to cropping, for the most part, that's why I said that should have come with an asterisk. So if you have this, for example, when I talked about cropping, largely we're not going to be cropping the photos, yes. But something like this, if you wanted to crop out, I know it's kind of an odd, like obviously it's not even. If you wanted to crop out some of this white space and come in more so you didn't have this awkward space, that's fine. As long as you're not actually like cropping the image like a square here, you know what I mean? Like you're not actually physically cropping the artwork itself. I wanted to be specific with that. So like these, for example, like don't use half of this photo. But if there's a photo that has like extra around it, like this one, for example, it specifically came up because a student wanted to use this photo. There we go. A student wanted to use this photo, but they wanted to crop it a little bit because they wanted to crop some of this extra space that was like the ceiling and the walls and the floor of the gallery, right? And I allowed it because technically you're not cropping the artwork in this sense. Like you're cropping out the ceiling to the gallery. So it's like, all right, like for that, I'll allow it. Again, sort of like this one, as long as you're not cropping the work itself. Like the car hood, if you wanted to come in just a touch to crop out some of this white space where it's hanging on the wall, and you wanted to come into the work a little bit tighter, like I would be okay with that, as long as, again, you're not actually cropping the object, right? And then this is just sort of a quick retro, like this one, another one, if you want to come in a little bit. And this is a part of the artwork, so you're not cropping the actual pedestal there. There's a Sonic Youth Nurse. There we go. So anyway, just to give you a little bit of another retrospective of his work quickly. So do some research. Check if this is the one that he's in trouble for now recently. And then our Spiritual America. And then there's he's an odd looking man. He always does that, like, he's got that weird smile-ish, I don't know, he's an awkward dude. But anyway, a couple of images to use of him. If you choose to actually put an image of him in there, you don't have to use all of these images. You have to use at least 6. You are more than welcome to use more. I wanted to address the cropping issue as the last thing before we close up for the day. Are there any questions? I know that was a lot. I literally talked for 2 hours.
So for instance, is the one that you have highlighted right now, the nurse, or
this one?
The yellow one that you had highlighted.
Yep.
This is all considered part of the artwork. So specifically the yellow one that had him asking about who's your father or something like that.
Oh, the argument one, the joke painting. This one? Yeah.
So in that instance, we could crop the white.
Yes.
But all the yellow is considered part of the
Correct. Yep, because that's the actual canvas. Yep. Yeah. So you wouldn't crop this so that it's like a square going from here to here. But if you wanted to, like, obviously the image isn't necessarily straight. So if you wanted to straighten out, like rotate the image a little bit so it was more straight and then crop out the white space, yes, you were allowed to do that. As long as you're not physically cropping the actual image of the artwork. Yep.